Chapter 23, Vermont, November 1846. One more night along the way, and the sky had turned into the underside of a thick quilt. The coachman pressed the team, eager to get to the next stop before the snow began to fall. It was nearly dusk when the coach took the final dash around the curve in the road that brought it to the door of Cutler's Tavern. Nothing had changed except herself. At first, Tryphena pretended not to recognize her at all. "This grand lady come from the city of looms and spindles." But soon the game was over, and the old cook gave her a warm embrace and drew her to a seat by the giant fireplace. "I would have thought you'd have cooked stove by now," Lyddie said, half teasing, as she looked around the familiar kitchen. "Not while I'm cook here," Tryphena said fiercely. "I reckon everyone has those monstrosities in the city, eh?" "They work fine. We had one at the boarding house." Tryphena sniffed. "They'll do, maybe, for those who ain't real cooks." She handed Lyddie a cup of her boiled coffee, thick with cream and maple sugar. "So you're for a visit home, eh?" Lyddie was brought back with a pang to her present state. "I've left the factory," she said, "for good." "So it's back to the farm, is it?" "My uncle sold it." "But what of your poor mother and the little ones?" "Mama died," Lyddie said. There was no need to tell Tryphena where. "And baby Agnes as well." "Oh, dear," said Tryphena softly. "So Charlie took Rachel to live with him at the mill. The Finneys had been good to 'em both. So," she took a long drink from her coffee. It scalded her throat, but she shook off the pain of it. "So, for the first time, I'm a free woman. Not a care in the world." She paused, not knowing how to say then that she wished therefore to become once more a housemaid in Mistress Cutler's tavern. "So I thought to meself, what fun to work with Tryphena again." The cook threw her head back and laughed. "She thinks I'm joking. How to explain? How to say I've nowhere else to go?" And then the girl came in. She was no more than 12 or 13, dressed in rough calico with ill-fitting boots. Lyddie's heart sank. That was the housemaid. There was no room for her at Cutler's Tavern any more. As it was, she spent the night in one of the guest rooms, paying full price, although Mistress Cutler pretended for a moment that she couldn't possibly take payment from an old and valued employee. Lyddie lay awake, wondering at the silence outside the window, the only light, the cloud-veiled moon. How could you sleep in such a quiet place with no rhythm and clatter from the street? Nothing at all to distract your head from wondering what on earth you could do, where you could go in a world that had no place for you, no need for you at all. "Then you're off to see the children today?" said Tryphena as she fed her breakfast at the great kitchen table. Lyddie was grateful to have plans for at least one day. "The snow is no more dustin'. I can get Henry to take you in the wagon." Henry was Willie's successor. Lyddie chose to walk. The day was cold and clear, but her shawl was warm and her boots stout and well broken in. She was at the mill by mid-morning. Mrs. Finney greeted her kindly, but Charlie and Rachel were gone to school in the village, so she just kept walking, her feet taking her up the hill road, past the fields and pastures of Quaker Stevens's farm, and on upon beyond, until she rounded the last curve and saw it sitting there, squat and homely, against the green and silver of the November mountain. A tracery of snow lay on the fields and in the yard, but it was not true winter yet. In a week or so, everything would be sleeping under a thick comforter, but for now, the cabin stood out in all its sturdy homemade ugliness. Just like me, she thought, and blinked back tears. It was good to be home. There was no wood piled against the door. Someone had stacked it neatly again in the woodshed. The door itself had been repaired and fit snugly now into its frame. She raised her father's wooden latch and pushed it open. Even at the brightest midday, it was never really light inside the cabin. On a November afternoon, it was truly dark. She found the flint box, no sulphur matches here, and lit the neatly laid tinder and logs. It was as though someone had prepared her for her coming. She pulled her mother's rocker close and stared into the flames. Nothing smelled so good or danced so well as a birch fire. It was so full of cheer, so welcoming. Lyddie stretched her toes out toward the warmth of it and sighed, nearly content. She could almost forget everything. She was home where she had longed to be. Perhaps she could just stay the night here. No one would care. How could they deny her just one night before she left forever? "Lyddie?" She jumped up. There was the shape of a man, bent over low so as to clear the doorway. He stepped into the cabin and straightened tall. "Lyddie?" he said again, and she knew him for Luke Stevens. She was more angry at the interruption than ashamed to be caught. "Lyddie!" he said a third time. "Is it thee?" He took off his broad Quaker hat and held it over his stomach, squinting a little to see her through the darkness. "I meant no harm," she said. "I just come to say good-bye." It sounded silly as she said it, coming to say good-bye to a cabin. "Mother thought she saw thee pass. She sent me to fetch thee for supper and to stay the night if thee will." She wished she could ask him just to let her stay here for this one night, but there was no food, and she had no right to use up the Stevenses' kindling. She would not be beholden to them more than she could help. "I'll just be going back." "Please," he said, "stay with us. The dark comes so quick this time of year." Her pride fought with her empty belly, but the truth was it had been hours since Tryphina's breakfast, and the walk back would be long, dark, and cold. "I've no wish to impose." "Thee must not think so," he said quickly. "It would pleasure our mother to have another woman in the house." He smiled shyly. "She often complains that none of us boys can seem to find a woman who will have us." He came to the fireplace and knelt to separate the logs and put out her small fire. She was glad his back was to her, and there was no chance that he could see her face flush red in the shadowy light of the cabin. "About your letter," she began. He shook his head without turning to her. "It was a foolish hope," he said quietly. "I pray thee forgive me." They walked side by side down the road, the sun a blazing pumpkin as it fell rapidly behind the western mountains. Luke's long legs purposely shortened their stride so that she would not have to skip to keep up. For a long time neither spoke, but as the sun disappeared and the dust began to gather about them, he set his gaze far down the road ahead and asked softly, "Then, if thee will not stay, where will thee go?" "I'm off," she said, and knew as she spoke what it was she was off to. To stare down the bear. The bear that she had thought of all these years was outside herself, but now truly knew it was in her own narrow spirit. She would stare down all the bears. She stopped in the middle of the road, her whole body alight with the thrill of it. "I'm off," she said, "to Ohio. There's a college there that I will take a woman just like a man." The plan grew as she spoke. "First, I must go tomorrow to say goodbye to Charlie and little Rachel, and then I'll take the coach to Concord, and from there," she took a deep breath, "the train. I'll go all the rest of the way by train." He watched her face as though trying to read her thoughts, but gave up the attempt. "Thee is indeed a wonder, Lyddie Worthing," he said. She looked up into his earnest face as he leaned to speak to her, and saw in his bent shoulders the shade of an old man in a funny broad Quaker hat, the gentle old man that he would some day become and that she would love. "Tarnation, Lyddie Worthing, ain't you learned nothin'? You don't know better than to tie yourself to some other living soul. You'd only be asking for trouble and grief. Might as well just throw open the cabin door full wide and invite that black bear right on to the hearth." Still, if he was to wait. He was looking right at her, his head cocked, his brown eyes questioning. His face was so close she could see a trace of soot on it, like Charlie. The boy could never mess with the fire without getting all dirty. She held her hand tightly to her side to keep from reaching up and wiping his cheek with her fingers. "Will you wait, Luke Stevens? It'll be years before I come back to these mountains again. I won't come back weak and beaten down and because I have nowhere else to go. No, I will not be a slave even to myself." "Do I frighten thee?" he asked gently. "Eh?" "Thee was staring at me something fierce." She began to giggle as she used to when she and Charlie had been young. His solemn face crinkled into lines of puzzlement, and then, still not understanding, he crumpled into laughter, as though glad to be infected by her merriment. He took off his broad hat and ran his big hand through his rusty hair. "I will miss thee," he said. "We can still hop, Luke Stevens," Lyddie said, but not out loud.